You're listening to The Sister Trill with Danai and Kiveli.
Hi everybody and welcome back to The Sister Trill. I'm Kiveli.
And I'm Danai.
And we're coming to you from our mutual home in Berlin. Today's episode is an immediate continuation from the last one. It's our musical journey part 2. But before we directly dive back into it, let's first start with our usual segment, What We Disagreed on This Week.
Okay, so I'll go first.
Okay.
My thing is actually quite a little thing. It's kind of funny. Mm-hmm. This week we're planning a kind of big party, our first big party in this house. And it's not just a party, it's more like a party weekend with several events planned. So it's going to be very big. And we were talking about the breakfast situation because we have several people that will be staying at our house. And we were talking and we had a kind of a typical disagreement, I would say, between us. Kiveli was very much on the side of going all out and being an incredible host and putting out a buffet. And she was thinking everything salmon, everything needs to be out. And I was like, yeah, let's just take it easy. Let's have a little bit of bread and let's see. And I was just kind of playing it chill. So it wasn't really a big disagreement. We were just kind of discussing it. And of course, we will find a compromise.
And actually, exactly along the same lines, also for the party evening, because we're starting early enough for it to be sensible to have like dinner options there. I was like more on the side of, let's prepare like many different snacks and many different options. And Danai was more on the side of, why don't we just write to everyone that everyone brings something like of their own. And I always think like if I'm a party guest, I like this added responsibility of, hey, bring something, like always kind of, I much prefer the style of like you go and you just have the experience. So
basically what we take from that is Kiveli's the better host.
Well,
the two of us.
We'll see. We'll see how the party goes. Okay, so last week we stopped right when our first teacher, Karl-Heinz Kämmerling, had died. I was 17 years old and you were 21 years old, almost. And then we both changed to one of Karl-Heinz Kämmerling's students. And I think up to then, he had definitely been one of our musical idols, just pianist-wise. We had played once in his incredible chamber music festival, I think a turning point for us both in the way we approached the music world. It's Last Vogt. And first, why don't you tell me a bit how you felt about that change? First of all, like that moment. I mean, it was a huge shift. And then like kind of the differences in teaching and in what you learned.
Yeah. The death of Karl-Heinz Kämmerling, of course, was a very difficult moment, I think, in both our lives.
What did you do? Like, how did you, what was your first reaction?
Well, for me in particular, because as you know, I was like with him in the final months and kind of like taking care of him and visiting him. So I was very close to him, especially in the end on a personal level. And when he passed away, it was one of the days that I was visiting him because I was visiting almost every day. And he had said, come at 3 or something like this. And I remember that I had come, 10 minutes later, maybe like 10 past 3 or something like that, for whichever reason. And I arrived and the nurse at that home said, he just passed away, like just 3 minutes ago or something like this. But I didn't really feel bad, like, I wasn't there, but it was kind of to be expected. It was kind of obvious. He had spent the last day already being very calm, and everyone said, yes, it is his time. And I think it was a very nice end. In the end, he had met some very crucial people again, and I think it was very nice. But for me, I just remember going into that room and seeing his dead body there, and I don't think I had ever seen a dead body up to that point consciously. Well, actually, it's not true. I saw our grandmother, at her funeral. It was an open casket, But being there in that room alone, and the nurse said, okay, I'll leave you alone for a minute. And I was just with that body. It was very strange to me. And I remember she closed the door and I just started crying.
Okay.
I started crying and I just saw him and I don't know, I just felt like I didn't want to let go just yet. I felt like, oh, please stay and teach me more things. but yeah, this was just the very first moment. Then I went back home and you were there also.
I wasn't in Hanover. You called me.
But then you came.
I came the next
exactly.
day. Yeah.
Because I remember we were talking
Yes.
and we met up the entire class.
Yeah.
and
But
we had
that
this-
was like 1-2 days later.
Yeah. But this is kind of when I felt that it was starting to sink in, and once it had like really fully entered my mind, the next thought was, okay, so who's gonna be my next teacher? So once I really accepted, okay, he's gone, it's like, who am I gonna learn from now? So this was kind of the moment where I think all of us were unsure,
Yes,
because
sure.
he had a very big class. Also, we were, I think, 30, 40 people. Something like this.
Yeah. And he not just did he have a big class, but his class was his family.
Yeah.
So he had invested everything he had in these people. We were also like a family within the class.
Yes, and it's true. We were like a big family, and actually, after he passed away, we never were like a family
Again.
like that ever again. Because of course, we all kind of went to different teachers, and although we are still friends, and if we met up today, of course, we
Yes.
would all be very happy to spend time with each
Yeah.
other. But this feeling of we are one group with one common cause, that went away with him. But I remember then when this option came up with Lars, and I started talking to him. And at that point, when Kemalin passed away, Lars hadn't even decided to become a teacher.
But Kemalin had asked him. That's what I find
Exactly.
so moving. Like Kemalin kind of...
Yeah. He had asked him, but Lars didn't know yet for sure if he was going to do it,
Yeah.
and where, and which university. But of course, it was in a way the perfect continuation, I find. I think there couldn't have been a better continuation, going from this extremely wise old teacher, Kemalin, to someone who was a student and who was at the height of his performance career as a pianist, with so much experience on stage.
Yeah,
and,
of course.
and really musically going into the same direction, though.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I remember this whole time very vividly. I was always kind of envious of the time that you had with him in the end, with Kemalin, because I still went to school during the time, so I didn't live in Hanover yet. So I only saw him sometimes on the weekend. And I did see him a couple of, obviously, like in the last, I think I saw him 1 week before he died, was the last time I saw him. And I also remember, I mean, these things are obviously so much clearer in retrospect than they are in the moment. But that last time I saw him was incredible. I mean, first of all, like he gave me a lesson through like listening to a recording together of a piece that I was playing at the time. And he also developed in that time with me like my next recital program. And, you know, he was using, you know, all this terminology that I had at that point, you know, musically grown up with. And I remember I washed his hair. Like he asked me to if I could help him wash his, you know, he was so weak at the time, like physically weak.
Yeah, he couldn't do anything.
And, you know, there was this bucket of water and, you know, so I mean, it was... I remember like at that time, it was this crisscross between still this incredible piano professor and just like a family member, you know? And then I remember that when I went out of the door, like to leave, to take the train back home, I remember I looked back and I was almost... like a part of me felt like it was going to be the last time I'd see him. I remember I always looked back and I was like, it's a good moment. It's a good moment for it to be the last moment.
It felt like a goodbye.
It felt like a goodbye. I remember I felt kind of, because I was supposed to come the next week again, but then he died a couple of days later and the next week. Right? So and I didn't say like good, like, but it kind of felt like an end in a way.
Yeah.
And then I remember that. When you called me, that's the other thing. Again, these things, as I said, feel much more pivotal and, you know, clear in retrospect. But I was practicing the slow movement of the first Scriabin sonata, a piece that he had just told me to like start learning, and it was like this very, you know, and I was sight reading it, so it wasn't like I was like kind of learning it for the first time when everything feels, you know, like every harmonic change, you feel it in your heart because it's the first time you're hearing it, kind of. And I remember I was like, wow, and I kind of, while I was practicing it, while I was playing it, I was kind of getting really, really sad and sadder and sadder, and I was alone in the house. Like our mom had gone, I don't know, to buy stuff or something. Like I was alone, and then I remember you called me and you said, "Hey, Kiveli, you know, we all know this moment was coming, and Kemalin died today." and we did all know that that moment was coming. And I was like, okay, thank you for telling me. And I remember I hung up, and then I immediately left the house. I didn't cry. I kind of, was breathless for about 10 seconds. I was like, I couldn't believe it. And then I kind of got super calm, and I called a very good friend of mine who, had kind of been with me through the time anyway. And I remember I went to his place, and, we kind of took my mind off things, and it took a very long time for me to understand the true consequence of that. To this day, sometimes, I still think, what if, he would have lived 10 years longer?
If he was still here.
What if I could play this piece for him?
Yeah.
And then what I remember in terms of changing teacher, that for me, it wasn't as clear cut as for you, that you directly went to study with Lars. For me, it was not that, because I was so, I would say, lost. I didn't really take a lot of initiative immediately. So I kind of didn't really make any conscious steps for about 1-2 months. And what happened was that there was also another teacher in the mix that I kind of played for. And I remember this contrast. I had gone to this other teacher to do a lesson with him. And then the next day I did a lesson with Lars. And I remember when I did this lesson with Lars, at that point, during the last months of Kemaling's sickness, we didn't really have lessons with him, obviously, not at a piano, right? Because he was already in the hospital. So I remember that when I played, and Lars was using all these words that I knew, and this whole mentality around music making, and also this whole humility in front of the music and the composers. And I remember it was I felt at home, It was this feeling of, okay, this is where I belong.
Yeah.
So
I totally understand.
This was my first contact, because also Kemaling was one of these old school incredible professors, but that also had a huge ego in terms of you were not really allowed to have lessons with anyone else. So at that point, I was 17 and I'd never had a lesson with anyone else apart from Kemaling and my music school teacher when I was 4 to 7 years old. So it was kind of also one of the first teachers with someone else anyway. And, to immediately feel this connection of, wow, the way he approaches music is the way I one day wish to approach music, is very special.
Yeah.
So,
and I think Lars also has this thing inside of him that music is the highest of all goods in life. Because I really think this is what Kemaling tried to instill in all of us.
Yeah.
He used to say this thing that music is an oasis of happiness and of bliss in this terrible world. You know? No matter what happens politically or whatever, violence, wars, music is untouchable. Pollution, music cannot be polluted.
Exactly.
It's untouchable. And I think in a way he did instill that in us.
Yeah.
And it's also absolutely how he lived his life. And when talking about these last weeks, and as you already said, he was very weak in the end. He was in a state where he couldn't even eat anymore and all these things. And when he listened to music, he was always turning into a different person.
Yeah.
I've never witnessed something like that because, I've also never really been with someone who was dying so intensely, but it was incredible. You would talk to him, you would ask him things, he wouldn't even respond. And then you would put a CD into the CD recording, or someone would play for him over the phone and I would hold it to his ear. And he would be back awake and somehow awoken back to life. It was incredible. He was starting to conduct and give a lesson. Basically, whatever he was listening, he was always giving a lesson. Saying, no, this phrase, and correct that, and no, tell him this needs to be piano.
Yeah.
And it was whoa.
The space between the movements is too long.
And he really lived for the music. And I think Lars also lives for the music. And it was important for us to have a teacher who really had that inside of him and wasn't just, yes, I'm a professional teacher, I have a lot of knowledge, but music really as, a lifestyle in a way.
I was actually, because when I was practicing Opus 111 by Beethoven, which is a big piece for us pianists, I was practicing it off of Kemaling's old edition. But I have because Lars actually, who now owns all of Kemaling's old scores and gave it to me, like scanned it for me. And I worked it both off of his like kind of teacher's edition, where like it's all the, you know, like things he usually would say students, but also off of his edition. I don't know if you've ever seen that edition of his Beethoven sonatas, where it's just his thoughts, where he kind of analyzes the piece, and it's like those small kind of phrases. This is like, you know, this is like the whole movement is working towards this note, and like this is the epilogue, this is a prologue. And I was just like astounded. I remember there was also this one masterclass we would do with him in Italy, where, you know, there was one practice room right next to his bedroom. Apart from the fact that this was the practice room no one dared to practice in, because like they knew that Kemalin was hearing everything. You could also always hear that he was in his spare time, which was basically inexistent. He was always
like
teaching
1 hour a day.
He was listening and analyzing music. Like he was just music through all.
Yeah.
It was amazing. So yeah, and for me, I remember what struck me so much when I started learning from Lars is obviously Kemalin was very aware of like the performing and like the, I would say, challenges that goes into performing in an analytical and a way. I mean, we spoke about it also in the last episode much more intensely, just how well he could relate, despite not actually being a performer himself. Now, Lars is the ultimate performer. I mean, that's what he, you know, that is his thing. He's he's much more a pianist, especially at that point, than he was a teacher, you know?
Yeah.
And his whole perspective on performing, to me, was so eye-opening. And I found it, because when I started studying with Lars, in terms of like, you know, the stage fright phase, I was definitely already, you know, I'd already lived with it for a couple of years. I was at a much different point. It didn't feel completely crippling, but it still was an issue. It still was, you know, a thing that I was battling. And I remember the fact that Lars was so open about the fact that performing, of course, is always a risk. That he himself, you know, despite being on stage his entire life, still has nights where he feels like, you know, it's a huge challenge, you know. And the fact that someone that, you know, I admired, I remember we heard him for the first time in concert when I was like 8 and you were 12, that was so open about the fact, like, the goal is not to never be nervous. The goal is to, you know, deal with it in a way that ends up being beneficial for the music. And even if sometimes it's not beneficial, this happens as well, you know?
I also found with Lars, not just the stage fright thing, because for me, I was kind of, I would say, over this crippling phase. I was at a level where I really had learned to deal with it, finally, 7 years later. But for me, I remember doing my first piano concerto with him in the lesson. It was very early on. And of course, as with probably almost any piano concerto, he had played it already 100 times in concert. And the things he told me were the most helpful things I have ever heard.
Absolutely.
I mean, he was like, okay, the orchestra comes in there. It's so important that you give the conductor a sign there so that you come together. Or here, the orchestra needs some more time, so definitely don't rush. You know, things that you just learn with experience. And I went to that first rehearsal of a, for me, new piano concerto, playing it first time with orchestra, equipped with knowledge of someone that had
and the
played
conductor is
50 times. And the conductor's like, wow, you really anticipate stuff. And it's like, well, yeah, I have some secret tips up my sleeve.
You know, I mean, I have to say, like, I think like piano concerto might be like his best area. And I mean, he's good in all of the different types, but piano, it's amazing. Like, even piano concertos he hasn't played. I remember I went to him once with Franck Variation Symphonique, a piece he hasn't played, it's with orchestra, and it's just like also not just like the actual practical tips of like this place, the orchestra rush, is also like general, I would say, guidelines of playing with the orchestra. I remember one thing he told me that to this day remains like one of the most valuable orchestra tips that he's ever given me, which is when you kind of have a place where you end a phrase and the orchestra starts on a tutti, don't try to start to end in the beginning of the orchestra sound, but try to end in the middle of the orchestra sound. And it like the first note of the orchestra, and it makes all the difference. In the one situation, you're almost always too early. In the other situation, it's like, you know, the orchestra just takes over exactly the moment where you're like at the height of your intensity.
I mean, it's the same thing as like with a slow movement, you know, the one last placed note, like pianissimo, also where you have to come like after you already hear the sound of the orchestra and still a little bit later to be together.
Yeah, or another thing is, I remember like when there are tempo shifts within a movement, he always makes sure it's never like, you know, I sort of play a bit quicker, you know, but it's always very clear, like, you know, triplets become quavers or something like
Yeah.
that, you know, like
Yeah.
so and I remember this one time that I was playing this piece and the conductor was like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "Well, triplets become quavers." She was like, "Okay, thank you," and it went perfect. I'm like, "Okay," I just seemed very, you know, like
Yeah.
like very well prepared. And I was like, "Thank you, Lars," you know, "Thank you very
Yeah.
much." So yeah, I mean, all these tips that come from like years of being on stage and years of developing tips and tricks, I mean, are incredibly valuable. The other thing that I remember, that there are like two just like simply areas of piano playing that I remember I found it also so fascinating, especially with Lars, is because Kemerling always was like very focused on sound, on like the sound production. But I feel like Kemerling was always very focused on clarity of sound, and especially clarity of sound of the upper voice. He was very upper voice oriented and sometimes bass oriented. And what I always found so interesting with Lars is the way he approached, you know, like the whole bandwidth of sound, also the middle voices. I remember so many times when there are like chords that could have like a more darker timbre, like a darker color, instead of playing it more quiet, or he just said, well, just shift the focus from the upper sound, from the upper note to the lower voice, and it's automatically going to become darker. You know, like his approach to sound is just incredible. I mean, the way he just produces it, like, and also the like security with which he produces, especially like quiet sounds.
Yeah, I think
is
the
astounding.
sheer like physical, you
Yeah,
know,
like control.
Yeah, he's so reliable.
Yeah.
You know, he sits at the piano and sometimes like, yeah, let me try this.
Yeah.
And it's like this triple P 10 voice chord that comes like all equal. And it's like, oh, nice try.
Yeah,
you know?
I mean, the amount of times, you know, sometimes, I know, we work on a grand piano that I find, you know, has a very unforgiving, bright, kind of shrill sound. And I'm like, yeah, the piano, maybe I'll use una corda. And I was like, let me try. And then and like, no una corda, no anything. And just like,
yeah.
And I'm like, okay, thank you very much. I should go practice. So, and then the other thing that I found super interesting, that definitely is also an extension of Kemerling's approach, but again, it's kind of the approach plus like the experience of having done it so much, is his approach to like pedaling. Like, I feel like Kemerling had many, many different styles of pedals that involved, like, you know, also like vibrato pedaling and pedaling with, you know, with like with certain physical movements. But Lars really taught me this whole like half pedaling, a third pedaling, an eighth pedaling, you know, pedaling for one hand but not the other. Like all these things that are almost like you don't really just do them in a physical way, but you believe in them in a spiritual way for them to actually work out. You know, it's physically not impossible, but it's very difficult to pedal for one hand and not for the other, especially if you're trying to pedal for the right.
Although this is something that Kemerling also talked about a lot.
Yeah.
Pedaling for one hand, not for the other.
But I mean, it's just like this whole approach to like, you know, pushing boundaries. Also the pushing boundaries thing. I feel like Kemerling also came from a very like competition-based piano playing that he often taught. I mean, he had the moments where he absolutely, you know, said, and now, you know, create something special. You know, I remember sometimes in a lesson, whenever I would dare to like, I don't know, do something spontaneous, he was like, that was a good moment, you know? But Lars, I think, took this to like another level of like, you know, really, really taking risks. And really, I remember also in our first duo lessons, it was all about like, you know, don't breathe in together and just play super rhythmical. Dare to, you know, take your time and feel it together. Even if sometimes, you know, you're not together, it's worth risking it for the times that it is together.
Yeah. I think what plays a huge role in Lars's personality as a musician and as a teacher is that he is so incredibly humble.
Yes.
And he's humble towards the music, of course, but also humble towards everything. I mean, he criticizes himself all the time. He never thinks, you know, yes, I'm the best. He went for lessons to Kemerling until he died. He was there every year playing for him. I remember this one time in one of the master classes in Salzburg in the Summer Academy where Lars came and he said, you know, nothing is working. And Kemerling said, no performance practice lesson today. My former student is here. And we were all like, ooh, you know, famous pianist. Lars, like, oh my God, he's here. Nothing is working right now. I have to teach him, you know.
Yeah. And he taught him
Yeah,
for
and
like hours. Yeah.
I spoke to Lars about that lesson later, and Lars said it was a life-changing lesson, because very often when you're on stage, this is what people don't realize, no matter how experienced you are and how many things you know, you get into certain habits creep in and you don't even notice, and then it's so valuable to hear once again, okay, don't forget this basic thing and this basic thing, things that you already know, but it's just so helpful to hear them again. And I think Lars is really so humble, and that really shows, you know, in his lessons, the way he teaches, in his music making, in the whole idea and concept of music that he instilled in us.
And I think then the last, of course, big thing for both of us, definitely in terms of like how inspiring it was, is also getting to know his whole kind of friend group of one more incredible musician than the next. I mean,
seeing him work with amazing conductors and also meeting those conductors. I mean, this is so valuable. It's so difficult to get into that and to be introduced to all of this world and to all these people by someone like him, of course, is incredible.
Okay, so as a next topic, I'm sure we're going to get back to like these type of things again in some questions. But the next one would be... obviously, we both then studied music. We did our bachelor's, and then we went and we're doing our master's. And what do you think about like studying music, pros and cons? What's your perspective of studying music? How much did it help you? How much did it, not help you?
I do think it's very important. I mean, I think that it helped me a lot. For me, also, studying was, with Kemerling was attached to having piano lessons 3 times a week.
But more like, not just like the lesson part of it, but like the actual other classes and stuff.
I know. I mean, just the piano lessons were 3 times a week plus performance practice, which was so intense, and I think I practiced so much during my study time because I needed to in order to keep up with all of this. And the other lessons, I mean, there's of course music theory and all of that, which I think it is definitely helpful to have a basic knowledge, depending of course on what you're going to do later. If you're going to become a piano teacher, or I don't know, maybe also as an accompanist, like all this harmonic knowledge helps a lot. But of course, as a performing solo pianist, actually, you don't need any other subject. Just, theoretically, you only need to know how to play. That's all you need to know. However, I think it's just the same as with going to school. We were talking about this in our school episode. It's good to have a general knowledge. It helps you. Everything influences your playing. And I think having theoretical knowledge, having music history knowledge, having opera history knowledge really helps. And sometimes I do draw from that. For example, this opera history class that we had, we learned so many interesting things. I mean, I learned about composers that I had never heard before, about things, sometimes when we are programming the festival, I go back to that and I was like, what did that teacher say? What existed back then? Some classes I found incredibly interesting, like music physiology, where we had this incredible professor that's actually a very advanced doctor for musicians, and he's very advanced.
Shout out to Professor Altenmüller.
Exactly, shout out to him. He's very advanced in his field. Literally, musicians from all over the world come to him when they have pain or problems, and he does so many interesting things. He measures what's happening in the brain while you play and all of that. And for example, he had some incredible insights about stage fright and all these things. So generally, I'm very much pro studies, pro school, pro studies. I think any added knowledge that you get to your craft is valuable.
Absolutely, Although I would... I agree with you 100% on all these things. The only thing that I always kept thinking that I'm just a bit ambivalent about, and I don't really understand it properly, is the fact that, because what we studied, it wasn't even like just music. We studied music with the direction of performing, because you can also study it with the direction of teaching or with the direction of teaching it in school, and we studied it in the direction of performing, which means that what you are kind of being prepared for is playing concerts. The more concerts, the better, just saying it, simplifying it, right? And yet, if you played concerts and therefore missed classes, you were kind of punished for it. You weren't allowed to miss more. And I always found that a bit weird, because from the high school perspective, where we were like super lucky because we were in a school where we kind of had this deal that we were allowed to do that. I get it, like if they're like, no, go to your regular school, like, learn your math, learn your physics. But from a music university perspective, I'm like, but that's what you guys are shaping us for us to go and play concerts. So why, when we go and play concerts and miss one class of something, we then don't get the signature, we then don't get the course, we don't pass the course. So that's what I always found a bit interesting. You know?
That's true. I mean, I also found that contradictory, but I also think that, most of the professors were kind of flexible with it.
Most of the professors were flexible with it, but one has to say that if push had come to shove, which, I mean, it didn't in the end, that the professors were not at all... they didn't have to give us that leeway. And I remember professors, when, certain professors had different approaches to it. Some wanted you to write an essay for every hour you missed. Some, were kind of like, okay, I'm super happy that you're playing concerts. Others were super strict, we both know there were some where you just couldn't miss it. Yeah. So it's very, I don't know, that's always what I found very interesting, because I just didn't understand why they wouldn't be just happy about the fact that we're playing.
I mean, I think a very valid question is also in how far do these studies actually prepare us for a career as a performing pianist. And I would argue for that specific thing, for a career as a performing pianist, they don't really prepare us. The only thing that prepares us is
knowledge.
Our teacher, like, with his performance practice lessons and everything. But if it wasn't for him, it's not like we get, so much experience in that. It's not that we talk about the whole business side of things, or not so much. I think it's changing maybe a little bit, but how to get into an agency, how to get a CD label, how to contact a promoter,
what to look out for when you're signing a contract,
how to write a biography, a website, all these things.
I think it's interesting because I think that it's shifting. Like the music university have become very aware of it and are kind of trying to introduce it as well. But even with us, and I think we did go to a university that is very much
quite
on
the
forward-thinking side. It was like you had, I don't know, these are like random numbers, 60 credit points for like, the total, music teaching and everything. And then you had like 2 credit points for self-management.
Exactly.
It's not in relation to what you're actually going to need. I mean, the main thing apart from obviously your playing, which is the main thing, should be the business side, handling your career. Because I mean, you need to be so entrepreneurial to pull off a career.
Yeah, and I mean, I needed to teach these things to myself.
Absolutely. With
I would have loved to have learned
and
something about taxes, for example. How to file everything, what to collect. Your expenses. What counts. These things that are very important for a solo musician, a freelance musician.
Yeah. So that is obviously, but I think it's very difficult. Like all these, innovative things. I think it's also you have to have the spirit to pull it off. The spirit is more important than just like, or is equally important to the knowledge, kind of.
Yeah.
But I definitely agree with that, and I think that the universities are shifting in that direction. But I think it's going much slower than necessary. Like there is still a big reluctance to accept the level of entrepreneurial spirit needed. Also, when it comes to social media, like they should have an Instagram class. Let's be honest about this. You need to have a Facebook, Instagram class, to just teach this whole mentality. Which hashtags, which accounts. I don't know. Like it is. This is all much more. I would say a realistic what we deal with from our day-to-day life than say the opera history, which is also interesting.
For sure.
But not as.
I mean, it's true. Yeah, it doesn't sound so glamorous, but our job is not just being inspired by music and practicing and discovering the meaning of the piece, but it's all of that, social media, all of this, organizing,
So that perfectly segues into the next aspect, which is that, because in the last episode we spoke a lot about like more our childhood years playing the piano, and obviously at some point that shifted, and like this whole phenomenon of a music career had to become conscious, it had to become more strategic. There had to be, short-term, long-term goals that went beyond, I want to be a concert pianist or I want to perform perform a lot, you know? So I wanted to ask you, because I think there we really have had a very different, I would say, story or approach to it. When do you remember being aware of like this whole beast of the business side of music? What were like your first thoughts, your first steps, and how was like your introduction to this for you yourself?
I think I became fully aware of it when I entered my first agency, which was when I was 16. This is when I signed with my first agent, who was a very small agent, and I was with him. He definitely did some concerts for me, and it was the first time that I started, paying commission, for example, after a concert. I was like, okay, wow, I'm not keeping all of my money. Interesting. This type of thing. And then I remember being kind of unhappy with the amount of concerts that he was getting me. And this is when I started thinking about, okay, what do I need to do in order to get more concerts and all these things. And I mean, as you know, 4 years later, I signed with a very big agency. And that's when, my mind was completely there, because this big agency, I don't want to say the name now, but one of the main ones. And they, of course, developed a whole career strategy with me. So this is when I started being in this world of which until then, by the way, with my small agent was unknown to me, planning repertoire 2 years in advance, for example. I remember when my agent wrote to me for the first time, okay, give me your recital programs for, I don't know, let's say it was 2012. And she said, give me your recital programs for 2014. I was like, what? Because until then, I had just gotten, okay, concert in 3 months. What am I going to play?
By the way, interestingly enough, the same approach as Kemaling's approach.
Yeah.
We're going to plan your next recital program now.
Exactly.
Like the next pieces you're going to learn are going to be part of your next recital program.
Yeah. And this was huge for me. And I remember in these first years, it was very hard for me to find this right balance between new pieces, old pieces, because then you also get replacement gigs and, all of this to really understand what can I do. And then also this agent was talking to me a lot about, what goes into a good program, how to form an interesting program. Don't just play whatever, because I remember the first program I gave her was like let's start with Bach, then a sonata, then a romantic piece, and then in the end a modern piece, this like whatever, very childish competition style.
Yeah.
And she said, look, this is not such an interesting recital program. And then she kind of told me, let's think about creative ideas. And this is when this whole thought process entered my mind. And I think from then on is when I was really fully into the career thing, and talking when we were talking about which orchestras to contact, which conductor to play for, and all of that.
I remember that my journey was in so far a bit different. Is I think it also has to do with our personalities, because I think that you're much more, conscientiously ambitious. I think we're both ambitious, but I'm ambitious, like, in a more, I would say, like in a less practical way, like you're more ambitious, like, okay, I'm going to write these 4 agencies or these 4 organizers, then I'm going to do this and this and this and that. And I'm like more, I have this energy of ambition, but I'm also much more like a face-to-face type of person. And I remember that my big issue for a long time, I remember it started when I was about 15, 16, and it probably ended when I was about 19, was that I had like an emotional barrier towards viewing this artistic endeavor that I loved. And it was for me all about, connecting with people. It was all about the thing, like this ideal, this utopia kind of.
The oasis.
Of like, exactly. Of connecting that to like the much more cold-hearted, strategic, impersonal business side, like, kind of having to, I remember in that point, I kind of thought, like, this is not something that, it should be so valuable by itself. You shouldn't have to fight, to be able to share something that is so valuable to all people involved. I remember I was thinking, not in terms of like me being so valuable, music being so valuable, So, I remember for some years, I almost looked down on your kind of the fact that you were like, okay, now this concert, I'm like, aren't you doing it because you love it? Why are you doing it to play this and this concert? And it was, and it's kind of interesting because now, years later, there is this one psychologist that I absolutely look up to and I find so interesting. His name is Jordan Peterson. And he talks about the very difficult thing for artistic people, like for very creative and open-minded people, and that they have like two main difficulties. And I just identify exactly with both of them. One is the one that I was just talking about. They have a very difficult time monetizing their creativity, which, I mean, now at this point I've accepted that it's needed. But like I would say about 5 years ago, it was definitely a thing for me. Like this kind of accepting you have to monetize it and that therefore you have to, be like take part in that game, in the business side of it. And then the other difficulty is they also have a hard time catalyzing an identity, because they're interested in so many things. And there was the other thing, like, it was many times when you like confront people in the business side of the music industry, they all talk to you about, like you have to have a very clear image, you have to have something that is, you can sell, something that's easily communicated, something that is who you are. And I thought, like, I'm so many things, I'm interested in so many things, and it took me a while to kind of, between all my interests, find like kind of, okay, what is it that makes me in a way, and where is it that I can add, like I can find the most fulfillment.
Yeah.
So, and I would say, I think that is something that I don't believe I'm alone that I struggled with it, like from the artistic perspective, kind of many artists that are such amazing artists, but just never accepted the jump from being just an artist to being an artist and a business person.
Yeah. And which I think maybe 30, 40 years ago, or maybe even 20 years ago, was an option and was totally possible. You could be this artist only with a very strange, crazy personality, and someone else, your agent, did everything for you. Nowadays, it is just impossible.
Yeah.
I mean, it's absolutely needed in the age of social media and this direct contact that you have to your audience. This, to put it in a kind of bad sounding way, kind of autistic artist is not what people are looking for anymore.
Yeah.
They're looking for an all-rounded personality, a package that they can sell, that they can look up to, that they can identify with. And
yeah. And but I also I remember that when I started, because the other thing that, again, going back to it, like the other thing that I was just so, I would say, like almost uninterested in is this whole side of how much money do you get for each concert, like, because obviously when you start playing the piano super young, and I mean, like our first fees were like 350 euros. When we were like, I don't know, 8 and 12, or and then the next, and then at some point it gets a bit higher and a bit higher. And I remember, like, I was grateful, and I was like, oh cool, I'm getting a higher fee right now, but it never was like a goal to get like higher fees or anything like that. I could never, and many music organizers also talk about that, like for example, don't play certain concerts without your like I would say minimum standard fee and things like that. But I do remember that when I started getting, I mean, like noticeably higher fees, that I started thinking to myself like, okay, wow, this is like a whole world in itself. And so, yeah, for me, it was kind of I would say I had a lot of resistance in the beginning. But now that I kind of have, I understand that you just have to, embrace it. I also find it a very exciting part of it, I have to say. Like this whole world of networking and connecting. Because the way I see it now is like, because you have so much more control over your own career in a way, compared to like, the model of the amazing autistic musician with an amazing agent behind him kind of thing, is you are, you can really also, I would say, collaborate with other interesting people. You can create these very interesting ideas and projects. And now I approach it more from the side of also like, when you approach organizers and things like that, of like, actually have this exciting idea, and if you believe in the idea enough, that's if you believe in the idea, in what you have to offer enough, then I think it's not embarrassing or uncomfortable to approach other people. I've noticed it now, like now that I've come up with some ideas that I really believe in, that I find it much less stressful to be like, hey, I think this could be really cool.
Yeah,
Are you up
for
for
sure.
programming
Yeah.
that? You know, if you're just kind of like, can you please give me a concert? You know, because that's how I approached it in the beginning. Like, you know, please give me a concert. I promise I'm a really good pianist. You know, like
Yeah,
this
yeah.
kind of, But the truth is you need to be like, no, I actually have this amazing idea.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, the idea might just be an incredible program, but, you know,
Yeah.
and I believe in it, and
Yeah.
I would love to share it with you.
Yeah,
That's like
for sure.
the approach.
Yeah.
Which actually, like, I probably maybe that's what you wanted to say anyway, but what would you say are you particularly good at in the business side of things? And what would you say, like, you're more uncomfortable with still, or, you know, you still want to work on?
Interesting. I mean, the thing is that I have to honestly say that I had never really had to handle the business side of things in terms of negotiating fees
Yeah, okay.
and all of that, because I always, you know, had an agent, which I must say, you know, basically every musician complains about his agent, and, you know, there are many things you can be unhappy with, but in the end, I'm incredibly grateful that I always had an agent, because it is a fact that, you know, agents can ask for more
course.
money.
Of course.
And yes, you pay the commission, but my fees, whenever I was with an agent, and
Always
also
higher. Same.
were always higher.
Of course.
Always higher. And I remember when I changed to that agency I was talking about before, my fees got significantly higher almost instantly. And I was like, wow, okay, you know, this is just the standing that an agent has that an artist doesn't.
Probably
And
could. It's just like we are not particularly pushy negotiators. one has
that's
to
true,
say.
but I do know from promoters that they will always give more money to an agent than an artist,
Okay.
because the agent just has different kind of leverage. The agent is the gateway to many artists, maybe also to one key, very famous artist that the agent has on their roster. So,
but I mean, I always wonder a bit, because, you know, there are different styles of negotiating, and I think you and I are both kind of, you know,
Yeah, we're not so
milder,
pushy. Yeah,
milder
yeah,
hearts.
yeah.
We're not particularly pushy. So I always wonder, you know, like,
no, you're
what would
absolutely
happen.
right. I'm sure that there are some pushy musicians out there that get incredible results.
Yeah.
But I do think that the best result will be from a pushy agent.
Yeah, no, of course, yeah.
No, but generally, what I think I'm best at on the business side, I think is actually, I would say, kind of, you know, going with the time and creating my own thing. I'm thinking now particularly, for example, about my YouTube channel, where I started this whole piano tutorial thing, something that is not so common, you know, with other pianists, and something that kind of sets me apart, and that, you know, gives a whole different profile to my whole persona. Because yes, of course, I'm a pianist and people can hear me in concert, and there are videos of me playing and all of that. You can buy my CD. Wonderful. But this is a bit of a different approach, explaining how I get there, how I build my technique. And I'm noticing that, you know, almost everyone is asking me about it, you know, journalists, promoters, everyone's like, oh, wow, and I saw this, how interesting. And I think this is, so I don't mean, you know, the YouTube channel in itself, but I just mean the fact that I like to come up with different approaches.
And you're willing to put a lot of energy.
Exactly, and I'm willing to put a lot of energy without expecting any, you know, financial success or immediate result. It's just because I like to actually be creative and create new things in the field of music. Just like, for example, when I was very young, I liked to compose, you know, just because I like to do new things somehow, not just the traditional playing, which I also love. But I think this kind of creating new things is probably my biggest strength. Also, in our festival, this is what we do, actually. Create programs. I think this is what I would say is my biggest strength.
And what would you say you're challenged by?
My biggest weakness? I mean, honestly, I think my biggest weakness would be contacting people that I don't know.
Cold calls. Cold emails,
I mean,
calls.
maybe even they're not completely cold. Maybe, you know, there is one mini link already. But I've tried that a couple of times. Now, not anymore, because now, you know, everything my agent does. But I tried it, you know, some years ago, and I don't feel good at it. I think that some things work out, yes, but I don't feel comfortable. I feel a bit strange. I'm great when I know the person, when he's heard me already. If, you know, I'm asking for a re-invite, yes, because then I can be like, yeah, it was so much fun. Here's my new program.
Yeah.
But this cold thing is hard for me.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
What about you?
I would say my biggest strength is the fact, I would say that I'm very memorable. That, you know, like, I think I'm very good in face-to-face interactions. And no, I don't want to just say very good, but I think I'm very present in face-to-face interactions. And I think it's important to be memorable, you know, to not be lost in the crowd. And I would say I'm very good at creating personal connections very quickly.
Yeah.
And that goes also with the audience, not just with, like, you know, but also, like, and because I really enjoy it. I mean, I'm such a social person generally. So I really, and I also have to say, I'm very skeptical of professional distance. I mean, you know that about me.
Yeah.
Like, I don't enjoy it a lot. I'm not professionalism. That's a whole different.
No, I know.
I love.
Yeah.
And professional distance, like, you know, for example, in German, you know, it's like using sie instead of du, things like that. Like, and also, like, general, this whole, like, you know, not crossing certain boundaries because it's inappropriate. And I'm someone, like, you know, there is no reason for these boundaries not to be crossed if the situation calls for it, you know? So I think, because I like it so much, I very quickly kind of make people feel very comfortable around me, because I try to, you know, make it to be like an opening and an inviting space. And that I think is, like, kind of my natural strength. And I think my weakness is very much the non-face-to-face. I would say discipline areas, like, you know, to then, if I promise to send an email with, like, I don't know, the program, to then actually do it, you know, like, to kind of follow up in the less face-to-face, social, spontaneous dimension. Like, that not just is it my weakness, I also just really don't necessarily enjoy it, you know? I wish if it would be possible to do all of it in person, I would love that. You know, obviously it's not possible, and, you know, I'm not complaining about that. But that, I would say, is the thing that I feel that I'm like not as good as in, you know, like this kind of, you know, having to sit down and write the dry email with the program after, you know, you've had that. Because I feel like in a conversation, things are much quicker paced, and, you know, you need to be much more present in the moment. And an email is, again, like, you know, you're again confined to this, like, dear sir, madam, blah, 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 you know, with warm regards, everything, you know, and you know, so that's basically the thing. I think I can always, there is still, like, a lot of space to improve. So yeah, which is interesting, because that's exactly the thing that you're super good in. You know, this kind of sitting down, conscientious stuff. Yeah, then I would like to, like, talk about starting our festival together, which I think for both of us was, we didn't approach it at all as a career move. Absolutely not. We didn't do it that way, but I think that it ended up being, it added an unforeseeably huge dimension to our career, I would say. So, what did it do for you?
Well, I mean, I think
apart from the joy of, you know, the festival.
Obviously, of course, we did it just because we wanted to bring music to the island and to have a beautiful week in Molivos with our friends. Starting, I think that in the very first year, which was 7 years ago, I feel like it was still maybe not 100% equal parts between us. I feel like in that very first year, you know, it was more like I was kind of inviting the people that I thought of, and you were, like, kind of going with it. But I feel like in the second year, that fundamentally changed.
And there was another dimension in the first year that influenced that. I don't know if you want to talk about it.
Well, I mean, there was how should we put that? There was another person involved that is not in my or our life anymore.
Who was very involved in the organization in the first year. And therefore you kind of, you know, he was very much, but also, I mean, I don't think that this is the reason why you were not so involved. Maybe it was the reason why I was more involved, right? I don't know. I mean, I would say that, okay, first of all, I mean, that is a different point, but when we started the festival, we were very unaware of what would go into it in the end. It's not like we had a plan from the beginning, like, okay, these are our tasks, and now we're going to work through them, and in the end, there's going to be a beautiful festival. I mean, it was such a learning by doing approach to the whole thing. And I just think that in this first year, and I mean, I was 19, right? When the first I was during the organization of the first festival, I was 19, right? So I definitely had no idea, you know. So that's why, I mean, I do believe that because you were and he was also significantly older than you,
Yeah.
which also means that, you know, he had much more of an
Much more
idea.
experience, yeah.
And therefore he obviously went to you, and then
Yeah.
you did it kind of
Yeah.
with him, and I was kind of, you
Yeah.
know,
no, but
not
yeah,
in it.
no,
That's
for
why,
sure. But
you
I
know?
feel like from the second year on, as you said, we kind of also learned from our
Exactly.
mistakes of the first year, and I think that we learned so much about.
Yeah.
Just people, you know, I want to say managing a team. I don't feel like we're managing a team, you know, like we're the leaders of a team or anything like that. But I feel like, you know, we do have to deal with
Many different types of people.
different characters and personalities from different cultures also. And I think that sometimes there are very difficult situations that we need to solve, and we did some team workshops also with someone
Yes.
that was leading them, not us, but we were part of them. And this helped us so much. I find not just, you know, what it takes to plan a great program, which by the way also we learned
Yes.
throughout the
Yeah.
years,
Yeah.
but also just what does it take to, you know, be able to talk with a production person, with a stage manager, with all of these things, and
with different types of musicians.
different types of musicians, exactly. And I think that it was very valuable for us. Also,
Yeah.
of course, we grew our network of musicians
Of
a
course.
lot
Of course,
because,
yeah,
you know,
yeah.
we played with many different people.
And I mean, I remember like the first times that like I would say chaos-inducing email came, like I was just totally out of my comfort zone. I was like, oh my god, what am I gonna do now? Like, you know, someone complaining about something,
Yeah.
or someone kind of last minute changing a huge chunk of the program or something like that. Something suddenly not working. Someone just, you know, needing to vent about certain things. And you know, in the beginning, I would take it so personally, like, oh my god, did I do something wrong? You know, at this point, I just understand that it's part of the process. You know,
It's part of it, yeah.
Quite regular that people are sometimes, you know, I don't know, offended about something. Other people, you know, and if you are kind of, you know, at the center of such a big endeavor, not just us, I mean, there are obviously other people involved in it as well, but sometimes we get those emails and it's just like, okay, you know, now we're going to approach it, just be patient, don't take it personally, find a solution, be, you know, understanding.
And once again, I have to say it helps tremendously that we are two,
Of course,
that we're
yeah.
together, because sometimes we get emails that are, you know, really difficult. And I think if it was just me or just you, we would feel a bit more lost.
Yes.
But like this, it's just, okay, I'm going to give you a call, or now, you know, I'm just going to come down here and talk to you and be like, okay, let's just tackle this. Let's just write this reply. And
Yeah. Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I find that the festival was one of the biggest educators for
Yes.
us in all the ways, and it's so interesting because it really wasn't a strategic move on
No.
our parts, which is probably I mean, again,
This is
like,
how the
you
best
know,
things happen.
This is how the best
Yeah,
things happen.
out of love,
Exactly.
out
It
of
was
dedication.
just out of like
Yeah.
a passion for the
Yeah.
place and for the idea.
Yeah.
So it really didn't matter to us, you know, oh, are we gonna, you know, manage to get into this newspaper or not?
Yeah,
It's
no,
all about
yeah.
creating that vision that we had, and
it
that's why
really wasn't
worked.
about the success for us at all. It was only about the joy.
The joy of bringing
Yeah.
music to this place.
And then slowly the success, let's say, kind of crept in. And
Yeah.
now, of course, we have, you know, a certain ideal that we always want to reach every year, of course. But
And no, I mean, it's. I'm so grateful to that.
Me too,
I
me too.
I know even sometimes, you know, during the year when things are like specifically stressful, or like, you know, we're getting a particularly challenging email or response from someone, we were like, you know, are we sure we want to get ourselves into that again next year? And we're like, you know, but of course, I mean, there is
Yeah.
no question. It's so, you know, like. It's such a gratifying experience at the end. I mean, it's so
Yeah.
worth it. Absolutely. So, and I would really recommend it to all artists and musicians out there that, you know, it's worth it. Starting your own endeavor, whatever that might be, whether
Yeah,
it's
it
a
doesn't
small
need to be a
concert
festival.
series, you know, whether it is like, you know, it's also, it enhances your life a lot, because within that adversity and the challenges, you really kind of create also a bit of a resilience for yourself. And I would say, like, you know, it has made me such a more, you know, comfortable person within the music business space for me.
absolutely, yeah.
Definitely worth it. Okay, so before getting to like a little end segment, I wanted to ask you, you know, like we kind of in the first episode spoke a lot about the whole childhood thing, and to get back to that, do you think that now we're obviously both trying to be adults, was it worth it? What would you have done differently? Like, you know, do you think it was worth all the, I would say,
childhood
unconventional
stuff.
and partly also sacrifices that we went through to do it? Or like, is there specific things you would have imagined that could have been done differently, less intense, more intense?
well, for sure, I would say yes, it was worth it. Absolutely. I don't think I would have wanted it any different way. Of course, I immediately think when you ask me, could anything have, if anything would be different, what would it be? I think that, I would say one day more or less practice would make a difference.
Exactly what I wanted to say. Exactly the same thing. Yeah.
Because I remember, our mother was very religious about this. Practice every day, even on holiday, everything. A piano-free day was a very rare occurrence.
Especially
in our
after
life.
the, I would say, very successful first piano-free day. We did that for like 7 years, where we went on a bike ride, and I'd kind of forgotten how to ride a bike, I would say. And I fell down spectacularly and opened up my knee.
Ended up in the hospital with stitches.
And that was taken as a bad omen for practice-free days in the future.
I mean, in hindsight, I would say, 1 or 2 more practice-free days would not have been a problem. But at the same time, I do also want to say that I think the fact that it was such a given that you will practice every day, and piano-free days are not just everywhere, right, left and center, I think was also important.
Yeah.
Because
the mentality
became the lifestyle. So generally, if I would say, would you change anything? No. I would keep it just the way it was, and it was absolutely worth it.
Yeah. No, I agree with it 100%. Of course it was worth it. Sometimes, when I am with some friends and the friends are playing, beach volleyball, and I'm literally unable to even get into the vicinity of the ball without doing a weird, embarrassing move. And I'm like, sorry, I never used to play these type of games as a child. And everyone's like, oh, okay, I sometimes think to myself, wow, I did have such a different childhood than most, with such different focus. And I do think that we have some huge blind spots, in terms of also TV shows that we didn't watch growing up and things like that. But I don't view that as something that I wish I had, instead of.
I mean, how much do we have instead?
Exactly. Yeah. So, but that's the one thing that what you said. I feel what maybe would have even enhanced our life would be if, for example, once a year we would have one week, instrument free. And I've noticed that, as we've mentioned now many times already on this podcast, is we did not come from a musical family. And I imagine that maybe, someone who is not a musician, but our mother but tries to do everything possible to make sure that we can become successful musicians, maybe doesn't have an awareness of what is truly tragic and what is not tragic, And many times the kids of extremely successful musicians that themselves, are taking music very seriously, because the successful musicians do have a feeling for what is truly tragic and not. They have these rituals of, and every summer for 2 weeks we put the instrument away, and we go on holiday, because that is actually very valuable.
It is valuable.
Putting the instrument away for a week or
maybe
2
instead
is
of
super
saying
valuable.
One random practice-free day, maybe, as you said, one practice-free week a year could have been a good approach.
Exactly. But I mean, no one could have known.
It's not like that messed us up.
No. But I mean, apart from that, we were extremely lucky. I mean, we have to say, no matter how hard it was, and we can definitely get into all the hardships and everything, we were very lucky that both of our parents did everything they could to make the potential of a career in this field a priority.
Yeah. In very different ways. I mean...
some of them challenging ways, but that is a whole other episode. But definitely, I mean, it gave us the life that we can now have.
But I also meant in both, the dedication of, for example, our mother traveling with us to a different city every weekend.
Absolutely.
Practicing with us, bringing us to master classes, and also the financial support, even providing the
financial
means
framework
to be able to go to master classes for 6 weeks in the summer and all of that.
Yeah. And I mean, that's why I also have to say I understand in a way why, these very high effort artistic endeavors very often come from households that are well off, because it is a very expensive hobby, you know? The good teachers, the traveling involved, the investment in the career, also whether it is concert dresses, PR agencies, instruments and everything. And I think that is a shame. I mean, I really wish that in the future we can, work on providing framework for people just based on talent rather than talent plus financial means. And obviously there are, programs in that direction already, but because, talent does not come hand in hand with financial means
not at all.
All right, so as like a last segment, I wanted to do like a segment of firsts, of like
Okay.
whether you remember like first stuff. So I would start off with first concert. Do you remember your first concert?
My first concert, yeah, I remember it was in the music school. I think it was like the Christmas concert or I don't know, autumn concert or something like this. And I played this piece called Trom Trom macht der Hans.
Really? That's what you played?
That's what I
love
played,
it.
which is a piece that consists of only the note C. It's literally like the second piece you learn. So it's
For me, it was the first. That was
no,
so much
I
better.
had one before, which was also only C's, but also in the same rhythm.
Oh, okay.
Because Trom Trom macht der Hans already has different rhythm.
No, I know. I remember.
So please don't.
I can still-
don't.
You see, I was just already so talented.
I can
that
tell.
I already pulled
already
off the C
skipped.
plus rhythm.
So yeah, that was my first concert. Very successful.
So my first concert was actually with you. It was actually a significantly harder piece, but it was Oh MacDonald Had a Farm, and you like kind of accompanied me. It was a forehand thing, and I think mine was. I'm not sure if I
One of
remember
those
it.
younger sibling perks that we once again have encountered right here.
Well, or you know, your perk is that you played twice in that concert, because once for yourself and once supporting your younger sibling.
Okay.
No, and I seem to remember it was not in the music school, but it was like in a museum. It was like a branched out
yeah.
concert of the music
Okay.
school. I kind of still have like I have a very clear picture of that room and how it looked. I
Okay.
think. I mean, I'm not sure, but I think it was 4, 5, 4. I don't know.
I don't remember.
Yeah. Okay. So first orchestra concert.
Ooh, first orchestra concert. Well, I remember that. It was Beethoven, first piano concerto, first movement, with the student orchestra of our university. It was during this summer master class kind of our youth student group, and everyone got to play one movement only of a concerto with orchestra, and that was the movement that I played. I remember loving it.
Oh, yeah.
I remember this feeling of having the orchestra on the left and this sound body next to me, just really like it was it
Yeah.
left a lasting impression.
Mine was Haydn Concerto, third movement, and I remember I had prepared so much for that concerto. I remember like the last 6 months had just been that. I mean, I was also super young. I was 8 years old, so you know, obviously, like I needed time to just learn the piece and stabilize it. I was super well prepared,
Yeah.
and I remember also loving it. You know,
Yeah.
that was still in an age where I was zero aware of the pitfalls of everything. I was just there enjoying myself, and like this whole year, I remember like just the whole ritual involved. I mean, remember it was not just like the playing was exciting, but the fact, you know, you had to walk on stage, shake the hand of
Yeah.
the conductor, shake the hand of
No,
the
not the conductor. Shake the hand of the concertmaster. You walk on stage with the conductor. You already got the ritual wrong.
No, but hang on a second. Yeah, but at that point, the conductor was already there because he was conducting
okay.
everything. I'm talking about the specific concert.
But did you shake the hand of the conductor
Yes.
before you played? I've never in my life
I
done
shook
that.
I shook
Okay.
the hand of the conductor,
Okay.
then of the concertmaster. Then I
Wow.
sat down, and I remember I always messed up the order, whether it was first concertmaster, then conductor, or the other way around. And then
I
you
love
play, and then afterwards you shake the hand of the conductor again, shake the hand of the concertmaster, you take a bow, and you go off stage. And it was this whole like you know absolutely ritualized routine of that's what you do, and even that was already exciting,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And also like this whole thing of, and then the orchestra stands up, and you kind of have to turn around. And I don't think I even got to that phase when I was 8, but like you know, you have to applaud the orchestra, like all of these things. I remember it was just fascinating to me. I loved it.
I remember you told me before that concert, I hope I don't forget to shake the hand of the conductor after I'm done. Like this was what you were most nervous about.
Oh, and then I remember like in this phase, because then the next year I played Mozart A major concerto again, third movement, and it was when I played it with the quartet. Because anyway, I just remember this one time that I had already decided what like comment I would make before I went on stage. Super professional. Instead of just listening to what went wrong, being like, maybe we can try this place before. I'd already made up my mind of what I was gonna say before I went.
Got it.
And then I remember, like, you know, I was like, actually, I was thinking maybe in this place, could we take a bit more time? And I remember there was this one cellist that took me so seriously, and I felt so important. He was like, of course. The soloist just said she needs more time in that bar. And I was like, I did, you know, and I felt so important. I remember these
Oh my God,
moments.
that's so cute. Oh wow. No, I didn't dare say anything for quite a while there.
But I love the fact that, you know, I didn't react to it. I already had planned that I was going to say one thing. By the way, this little plan at some point backfired majorly when, like, ages later, I was already significantly older. I asked the conductor, like, whether I could, whether it was possible to play something a bit slower because I'm having, like, a technically very challenging place and, like, the oboe has the theme. And the conductor looked at me and looked at the oboist and was like, she asked the oboist, is it okay for you to play it in that tempo? You know, like that quickly? And the oboist was like, yeah, it's okay for me. And he looked at me and said, we're keeping it in this tempo. And I was like, okay, thank you very much for nothing.
Wow, that's a bit rude.
Okay, so first chamber music experience. Also when you, because I know we both played some when we were very young, but then also when you were like older with like, you know,
Okay, so when I was young, first chamber music experience was with, oh my God, I'm
outside of piano duo, right?
Yeah, outside of piano duo. Was it with cello or with a trombonist?
Oh, I remember.
Because I did some strange chamber music things. I did a duo with a trombonist. Then I did this whole long thing with a cellist. Mm-hmm. Then I did with a flutist.
Yep.
So I had quite some chamber music things when I was younger. But then the first real chamber music thing when I was older, I would say, is with my still chamber music partner, a cellist that I still play with very, very regularly. And this was, kind of the beginning of our duo journey, which now is also 10 or more years ago. I think this, before, of course, it's not quite true that this was my first experience. I mean, before, of course, I had played some trios and everything, but this was somehow a very lasting one.
Yeah. For me, I remember the first one I did was, again, like super early on. I think when I was like 6, like, you know, when you did your first things.
Yeah.
I played like something with a cellist, I remember. But I mean, it was a tiny thing. I barely remember it. And then for a very long time, I did nothing. Like when you were doing all these like, you know, competitions with the musicians, I was just playing solo. And then I remember when I was about 15, I played for the first time again with like chamber music at our teacher's festival, at Lasse's festival.
Right. Yeah.
And it was the first time that I'd played since I was 6 years old, and now I was 15, so very different stage, you know, in my life. And I remember I loved it so much. I played just this very small piece. I remember I played Élégie by Fauré, and it was like this, you know, really, really good cellist, and he was super nice, and, you know, we didn't rehearse it very much because it was a very short piece, and, you know, but I remember like just this whole listening to someone and reacting to what they're doing. I loved it so much.
Yeah.
Like I just naturally felt drawn to this type of music making, and, you know, since I've just fallen in love with it even more. Okay. First famous person you met in our field.
Ooh. I think probably it must have been Kissin.
Yehudi Menuhin?
Oh, was it before? I mean, I met Yehudi Menuhin when I was 8. Is that right? I think 8. I mean, for him, it was a big thing because I played for him. So it was more than just like a meeting. But before that, I had been going to concerts of famous people.
Yeah.
I feel like I met Kissin before that and was majorly in love with him also.
Shout out to Kissin.
And then Menuhin probably even more famous than Kissin, I guess, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
Kissin is pretty famous.
Kissin is pretty
so
famous,
is Yehudi Menuhin.
But Menuhin is maybe cooler because he actually heard me play. So.
Yeah. For me, I mean, I remember, of course, like seeing a lot of them on stage, although I feel like I went to less concerts when I was younger than you, because you used to go to concerts with our father.
No, not at all. I used to go to concerts with Marina. With my piano teacher.
Oh, okay.
With my music school piano teacher. This was another one of those cool lifestyle things.
Okay, yeah.
She would always book tickets.
I see.
And then we would go to concerts and it was a whole ritual.
Okay.
She would dress super nicely. I would dress nicely and we would talk in the break.
But in any case, for some reason, I missed that phase. So I didn't do that,
Not going to talk about it.
No. Go for it. No, totally. But I remember the first person I was truly starstruck by, was a lot older, is because Lass, our teacher, has a very good connection. Well, he's played a lot with Simon Rattle. And I remember when I was 17 or 18 in one of my first lessons with Lass, and he was living in Berlin, and he did it at the Philharmonie in Berlin, in the conductor room, kind of. And I remember I was playing Chopin preludes with him, and it was towards the end of the lesson, and I was like playing through for Lass, like the last few preludes. And suddenly someone knocked on the door, and the door opened, and Simon Rattle walked in. And I remember, I think I forgot how to play the piano. You know, like I was like,
Oh my God, yeah.
oh my God. Like I couldn't believe it. And I mean, Simon Rattle was one of these people that I had idolized for years. I mean, to this day, he's like one of my favorite musicians ever. And I remember being truly starstruck by him.
I can totally imagine. This also happened to me once in a
With
lesson at the Philharmonie. But actually, maybe one more little story that is kind of similar to that is when I was playing in Switzerland, in Lucerne, in the KKL, I was rehearsing on stage for a lunch concert that I was going to play. And literally, I thought I was alone in the hall. I was like exercising, whatever, doing my things. And then someone just like went like this on my shoulder, like tap on my shoulder. And I turned around and it was Sokolov standing behind me. Literally. And the only time I had seen Sokolov in my life was when I went to a recital once back in Düsseldorf when I was very young. And I was like, I didn't even know what to say. And then he's like, excuse me, can I try the piano? And I was just like, yes. And I like stood up, you know. And he sat down, and then this lady that we both know that is also very often in Heimbach, but that actually works in Lucerne, she was like, sorry to interrupt, he's here to choose the piano for his recital tomorrow evening. Yeah. Because it was the piano fest in Lucerne. And I was like, oh my God, wow. Yeah, and then he played this piano, which, by the way, I thought was an amazing piano. He played it and he was like, not that one, not that one. Which, it was a new Steinway D, of course. He was, not that one, not that one. And then they were like, okay, let's find another one. Like, rushing him to the next piano. And I was like, all right.
Oh my God, yeah. I also remember, the other two stories I remember is the first time I saw Martha Argerich. But with her, it was like literally a celebrity situation, because it was again at the Philharmonie in Berlin, and I knew she was playing a concert, but obviously I didn't go to her backstage room or anything like that, and because it wasn't like she was just preparing for a concert, and then I saw her like walk by the cafeteria, surrounded by like a throng of people around her, and I was also like, oh, that's Martha Argerich, you know, like totally.
You know, I feel like we could do almost an entire episode on like encounters with famous people, you know, like famous people from the industry, but also other people. I mean, we've met like really famous people, like, I don't know, the Dalai Lama or like politicians. I feel like this could be a fun episode to do.
Maybe. And then the other thing I remember is like the first time we were at the festival from last, again, that same festival when I was 15, just the amount of like music personalities that were there, and they were kind of like arriving one after the other, and it was just like, this is a whole other level of music making that I've never been a part of before. So that was super interesting. Okay. First, do you remember your first like exam? You know, like whether it was an entry exam or something.
Well, first of all, I remember
the Marina one.
Exactly. Exams at my music school with Marina, which were the scale exams.
Yes, those I remember as well, vividly.
And this was definitely my first
exam.
Hated them. Oh, I loved them. I loved those because I feel like I was good at scales. God. And I feel like I was always very prepared, and I went in there and she was like, okay, yes, then and you had to somehow prepare 3 keys, and she was like, play this key, and I was like, playing it very happily. Yeah. I was feeling very secure because it was kind of easy. You only had to play the scale.
The reason why I felt uncomfortable was because I felt like the whole vibe was meant to like artificially make you nervous, because you would go in and be like, so Kiveli, are you prepared?
Really?
And I was like, I think so, yes. And then like, okay, so which scales did you prepare? And then it's like, you know, this one, this one, and this one. Oh, this one's difficult. Why don't you start with that one? And you know, like the whole thing, I was like, okay, you know, so I remember I really didn't like those exams. And the other ones that I remember I didn't necessarily like very much was the theory exams.
Yeah.
Because like I always ended up doing very well, especially like, you know, in Gehörbildung.
Solfège?
No, basically like, you know, Gehörbildung is the thing that a person plays a tune on the piano and you have to write it down just by listening it.
But that's called solfège, no?
No, I thought solfège is when you look at notes and you immediately have to sing them.
I might be wrong. I don't know.
Okay. In any case, like that's what it is. And I was always so scared that I wouldn't be able to hear the melody. And then, you know, you hear it the first time, you're like, oh my God, I don't know it yet. And then like the second time, you know, you start piecing it together. Yeah. That's a whole. Oh God, I haven't done that in ages.
Yeah, same.
We should do an episode where like we kind of go back to like these old things we needed to do for each other.
Oh yeah, and like actually do them.
That would be funny. Okay. Then the first, like, do you remember, and these two questions go together, the first, like, big piece or the first, like, hard composer? Like, what was the, because, in the beginning you kind of play, like, these pieces, from the beginner books, and, maybe there is a Mozart or a Haydn minuet in it, but, basically you're not playing pieces, you're playing fragments of pieces, and then at some point it's like, okay, now you're going to learn your first actual piece.
Yeah, I do remember. The first piece that was kind of like that for me was Schubert Impromptu, the A-flat major one. And I remember also like hearing Marina tell me, you have to understand the piece, you have to understand it musically. It's not just playing, and there's so much more to it. And I think this was the first piece like that for me.
I think for me, I remember picking like my first Mozart sonatina that I was obsessed with Mozart when I was like a kid. All I wanted to play was Mozart.
Yeah.
So I remember that kind of thing that I really loved, the sonatina, and then like later the Sonata Facile by Mozart was like my other next big thing. So that was probably my first piece. And then the last question I want to ask you is, do you remember your first amazing moment on stage?
Yes, absolutely.
Me too, but tell me your story first.
For me, it was in a piano competition in the Netherlands, in Enschede.
Oh, okay.
Where I was, I think, 9. And it was a big piano competition, actually. And I was taking part as, like, the significantly youngest person. And fun fact, for that, I got like kind of like a Grand Prix, which was like a prize that was invented even for me, like kind of like the cool prize. Anyway, there I remember playing my own composition as the contemporary piece. And this is something that I used to do during that time, also in other competitions. I also did it in Prague at the Czerny competition. And I remember feeling so comfortable on stage playing that, because in my mind I thought, nobody really knows this piece. I can play it as free as I want to.
Yeah.
And I remember having this freedom gave me such confidence and somehow made me really create something beautiful. And at the end, I also got the prize for the contemporary piece because I would say because of that, because there was this, moment of freedom there. Yeah. And I'm so sad because I've lost this composition. And I asked you about it actually. Right?
I know. Yeah.
I don't know. Somehow I lost the score, and there is actually a recording, but I don't know where it is. I don't know. I hope that one day I can maybe find it.
I'm sure. Anyway. Otherwise, you have to reconstruct it like hypnotherapy.
Yeah, I've already tried to, but I can't remember every bit. I just remember some bits.
It was called the Treehouse, right?
The Treehouse, exactly.
Yeah.
And it was inspired by Disneyland.
Oh, it's so cool.
Because we went to Disneyland Paris together, and we were in Robinson Crusoe's. Robin Hood. Wait, who had the treehouse? Robin Hood or Robinson Crusoe?
What?
In Disneyland, there's a treehouse of
I don't remember.
A Robin something.
I don't remember.
Is it? Did Robin Hood have a treehouse? I don't know. Anyway, who had a treehouse in Disneyland? It is in Disneyland Paris.
A treehouse.
A treehouse. And this is why I called it the treehouse, because it was inspired by that going there. And I composed going the steps, then all the rooms.
It was the last holiday we did with both of our parents.
Exactly. And every room was a movement of the piece.
Okay, I never knew that it was inspired by Disneyland. I only knew it was
inspired by that because I was there and I thought, wow, I should compose something about that.
That's so cool.
So I composed like the bedroom, the living room,
that is so cool.
The music room.
I remember the kitchen. The kitchen was like very active.
Like things are happening there.
Yeah, I remember the kitchen. I remember. My first amazing concert, I was much older, like the first time I consciously remember having like this moment of, wow, this is special. And it was right around like my stage fright time. And it was kind of like an oasis of hope in this whole phase, because it was one of my first, like, when I was piano recitals when I was older. I think I was like 15 or something like that. And I remember I went to that concert with the, I would say, pretty firm expectation that it was going to go bad in a way. Like I was not going to pull it off. It was too much for me to handle. And I also remember the program, I played like some Scarlatti sonatas in the beginning, then a Beethoven sonata, and then the second half was like some, more like showy pieces.
Yeah.
And I remember the whole hall was exclusively lit by candles. It was completely candlelit, and it was like not a very big hall. I would say it was like a maximum of 150 people, maybe 200. And it was like a very special atmosphere. But never that, like, even though that happened, like, kind of it all went over my head. I was just so nervous. Oh my God, how am I going to make this? And I remember I went out, I played the 2 Scarlatti sonatas. I felt very uncomfortable. It didn't feel good at all. And then I went and I started that Beethoven sonata. And I remember that midway through the exposition, there was like this weird perspective shift. I remember looking at my fingers and thinking, these are my fingers. Like, I'm in control of these fingers. Like, kind of, if I move them faster, it's going to sound faster. If I move them slower, they're going to go slower, And I remember to prove it to myself, I suddenly, like, did this huge accelerando that was, like, in like one bar. Well, it wasn't that huge. It seemed huge to me. Like, I suddenly, like, kind of did something I never would have done normally, Yeah. And I remember, and it worked, and it kind of sounded, like, spontaneous and sharp. And that kind of, taking the motivation of the success of this one bar just catapulted me into this feeling of I'm in control, like I'm the person creating this right now. And I remember I really got this feeling of wings out on stage. And after the sonata, I couldn't wait. Like, it was the intermission was then. I couldn't wait to go back out on stage and like get spontaneous again. And I remember that the feeling of that concert, knowing that was possible, it was carried me through the following years.
That's incredible.
And it was incredible.
What you described is exactly what Lars told me he does whenever he gets nervous. That he consciously does a big rubato, like he said, usually going slower though, doing a big ritardando just to prove to himself, look, I'm in control of everything.
Wow, that's so interesting. Yeah. All right. So, that brings us to the end of this episode. I have one actually quite funny story about you, because we were talking also more about the business side of things, and I probably don't think you remember it anymore. It was just very funny because it signifies like a potential misstep on my part, and you like saving me in a very elegant way. Basically, we'd gone to a concert of one like very accomplished musician, and that musician had kind of obviously had an off day. Mm-hmm. I remember he played something and it really it's kind of like this off day where the nerves took over and he kind of lost control on stage. And as a musician, it's noticeable. You feel that when someone on stage is kind of, holding on to control rather than letting go, right? And I remember and we'd gone backstage to see the musician because we knew that person. And basically, like there were some strawberries in the back, and I was like eating the strawberries, and I had wanted, and I meant it in like the most positive and complimentary way. I'd wanted to like thank the musician in a way for the fact that it was so refreshing to see someone as accomplished and as successful and as amazing of a musician as you, to watch you kind of struggle and kind of watch you play a concert that obviously didn't go very well, and you not being here backstage and crying and losing it. That's what I wanted to say. And I started saying like, wow, that was so refreshing. And you kind of gave me like a death stare, and you were like, was the strawberry super refreshing? And I was like, yeah, the strawberry was so refreshing. And you kind of saved me from like potentially, saying something really inappropriate to this musician and making him feel bad. Oh my God. And I was like, yeah, the strawberry. And I like kind of
I actually do remember that. I do remember that. Well, the thing is, I think that, probably you would agree that when you come off stage, the worst thing that someone can say to you is something negative about your performance.
I know. It wouldn't have been a good move. Absolutely saved me there.
Because I know that you meant it in the best way. And you didn't even mean, it was bad. But I think also for anyone out there listening to this, if you notice a mistake and you're so proud that you noticed it,
don't say it.
Don't say it to the musician the second after he walked on stage and just showed you the innermost part of his soul.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the classical people that go back and mean it well. I know that would have been a very bad thing. I'm very thankful to you for saving me there. But like, if come back and like, yeah, you know, actually I know that this part it says pianissimo, and I think you played mezzo piano, and you're trying to kind of share. It's really kind of not the right moment.
Yeah,
to
there's
say
a better
these
moment
things.
for it. There's a better way, but not like when you're still sweaty from the performance, going like, yeah, this could have been better. It's like, oh, okay, you know,
Thank
what
you.
am I gonna do with this comment now?
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. Anyway, my story is one that to me kind of is the turning point of our duo career. And it is the moment where we played Stravinsky, Sacre du Printemps, in Heimbach at our Teachers Festival. I feel like it is somehow such a key moment for me and
also
for
a key
us.
piece for us.
Also, definitely a key piece. This, I would say, has become our core, or one of our core repertoire pieces as a duo. And also just leading up to this. I remember him calling us and saying, can you imagine playing this? And to us, it was like a mountain that could not even be tackled remotely. It seemed incredible.
Yeah.
And then we said, okay, we're going to do it. And he was also just kind of like, no, I think you can do it. You should do it. And then we started practicing it, and we practiced it really intensely, separately, together. Then we went to a masterclass with someone else to work on it. And I feel like this is the first piece as a duo that we really transcended together somehow. We really understood it. We made it our own in a way. And I remember before that concert, I wasn't even nervous. I was so looking forward to it. I was looking forward to performing it. And there were, you know, typical Heimbach situation, all these superstars listening to us. But this was the first time that I was thinking, yes, they should listen to us. You know, I think we have something to say. And it was such an incredible concert. I remember playing, and the audience loved it.
Yes,
and
I remember.
It was just such an incredible
and it was also so
experience.
incredible because like I felt like I just wasn't nervous.
Exactly.
It was like just this excitement.
And it's an incredibly hard piece. It's not like it's an easy piece. But it was just, it was so nice. It was even with radio broadcast, which usually is very nerve-wracking. But it was so nice. And I think from then on, I feel like we really became so much closer musically as a duo. This piece really brought us close
and we
together.
just love playing it to this day. I mean, it's just an incredible piece. Really.
Yeah.
All right.
So
So this concludes today's episode.
Exactly.
And in the next episode, we're talking about something completely different, something non-musical, once again. But we're talking about what it is like to grow up as not purely German or purely Greek, but kind of a mixed, not mixed race, but... how do you say that?
No, a mix of two cultures.
Mix of two cultures.
Yeah,
and also very different cultures.
Yeah, what our identities are, what we identify with more, and also some funny stories connected to that.
Exactly. So we'll see you next week on Saturday. Sending lots of love to all of you. Bye.
Bye.
You're listening to The Sister Drill with Danai and Kiveli.